The future is uncertain. But this very uncertainty is the source of our hope. Freeman Dyson, welcome to a new deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, a major flashpoint in international relations. This complex question of Israel potentially launching a unilateral military strike on Iran. Our mission, like always, is to try and cut through some of the noise and get straight to the insights from the source material itself. For this deep dive, we've been looking at various reports, analyses, but focusing heavily on a really interesting article from Middle East Eye. It's called Israel's Solo Strike on Iran. A Risky Gamble. So we're here to unpack the key takeaways from that and other sources, explore the capabilities they talk about, look at the significant obstacles, and really understand the risks involved, but only based on what these sources are actually telling us. And for you listening, whether you're tracking geopolitics closely, maybe preparing for exams like the UPSC, where this kind of current affairs insight is, vital, or even if you just want to be properly informed on these critical global issues. Well, this deep dive into the sources should give you a clearer picture of the factors at play. Okay, let's jump right in. The sources, including that Middle East eye piece, they set the scene, right? Israel's openly threatening a preemptive strike. And what's interesting is this is happening or being discussed against the backdrop of the Trump administration trying to broker some kind of nuclear deal with Tehran. So a big theme that comes out is Israel's capability. Can they actually do this alone? What do the sources say on that?
Yeah, that's a key starting point. And what's really striking from the sources is the argument that Israel does seem to have a significant capacity for a unilateral strike. A major reason they highlight is that, unlike maybe some other partners the U.S. works with, Israel is described as much less reliant on American intelligence for this specific kind of operation.
Less reliant. How so?
Well, they point to decades of Israeli intelligence work inside Iran. Think about things like the assassinations of scientists and officials. These are examples mentioned directly in the sources. It suggests they've built up their own quite independent capability over time.
Right, okay. So they've kind of developed their own intelligence picture, meaning less dependence on the U.S. for this particular scenario.
Exactly. And the sources also mention that specific Israeli plans for hitting Iran's nuclear program, plans designed to be carried out without direct American help, weren't just, ideas on paper. Apparently they were actually shared with the U.S. administration, specifically discussed with the CIA director at the time, John Ratcliffe, back in April and May.
Wow. Shared the actual plans. And what was the U.S. reaction, according to these sources?
Well, a senior U.S. official, quoted in the material, was reportedly pretty impressed by the detail. These weren't just vague outlines. The plans involved pinpointing targets that support the nuclear sites, using a method they call target systems analysis.
Target systems analysis, what does that involve?
Think of it like, instead of just hitting the main facility, you go after everything that keeps it running. The crucial power lines, water supplies, the support structures. The plans, as described, went down to that level, targeting specific infrastructure linked to those nuclear facilities.
That sounds incredibly detailed, not just bombing the site, but dismantling its support network. Did they mention specific tactics, too?
Yes, the sources talk about potentially combining sophisticated cyber attacks with these precision military strikes. So a kind of multi-layered approach. And this isn't just theory. A former Pentagon official, Bilal Saab, he's quoted quite directly in the article. He says, "Can Israel go it alone?" Yes, of course.
He thinks they definitely can.
He seems convinced. He says they can definitely disrupt large parts of the program without destroying all of it. And Saab suggests this capability has been sort of underlined by Israeli rehearsals and even specific tit-for-tat actions.
Tit-for-tat, like demonstrations of what they can do?
Exactly. The Middle East Eye article points to Israeli strikes in October and April 2024 as possible examples. Israeli and U.S. officials apparently claimed Israel successfully took out Iranian surface-to-air missiles, radars, even those advanced Russian S-300 systems.
S-300s, those are quite sophisticated systems.
They are. Though it's worth noting the source also mentions Iran displayed an S-300 at a parade in April 2025. So, it's a complex picture. Maybe not all were hit or they were replaced. It suggests an ongoing dynamic. But the overall assessment from that senior U.S. official quoted in the sources was that Israel has the capabilities to set the Iranians back for at least a few years. And when they talk about how they might do it, the military assets. Experts in the sources mention a few things. Ballistic missile attacks, F-35 stealth fighters carrying 2,000-pound precision bombs.
The stealth fighters make sense for getting past defenses.
Right. And also F-15s, potentially armed with these huge 4,000-pound GBU-28 bunker busters.
GBU-28s, aren't those specifically for hardened targets?
Precisely. They're designed to penetrate deep underground structures. So mentioning those suggests some capability against even fortified sites, even if they don't have access to the really big U.S. bunker busters, the GBU-57s. Oh, and one other factor mentioned by some Israeli hawks, according to the sources, the perceived weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They apparently see that as potentially making a preemptive strike on Iran itself seem maybe a bit more viable.
Okay, wow. So if you just look at what these sources say about capability, it sounds pretty robust. Independent intel, detailed plans, specific weapons like those GBU-28s, even tactical demonstrations. But here's the puzzle, isn't it? And maybe confusing for you listening. If the sources paint this picture of strong capability, why the hesitation? Why hasn't it happened? What are the big hurdles and risks these same sources talk about?
Exactly. Capability is just, one part of the equation. When you look at the whole picture, the sources present, this really complex web of obstacles and risks starts to emerge. And arguably, these factors might outweigh the purely technical ability. First off, the most obvious physical challenge, Iran's nuclear facilities themselves. Places like Natanz, Fordo, they're consistently described as being buried deep underground, heavily fortified.
Right, the bunkers.
Yes. And while Israel might have options like those GBU-28s we mentioned, the sources often point out that the lack of access to the even heavier U.S. bombs, those 30,000-pound GBU-57s, the one stationed way out at Diego Garcia, is a key reason Israel might not feel confident it can take out the deepest targets alone.
Okay, so the very deepest bunkers could still be a problem without American firepower. What else stands in the way, beyond the physical targets?
This brings us to the political and strategic constraints. And here, the sources put a huge amount of emphasis on what they call the Trump factor.
The Trump factor.
Yes. Alon Pincus, a former Israeli diplomat, he's quoted with a very blunt line. Netanyahu is plain scared of Trump.
Scared of Trump? Wow.
That's the quote. The Middle East Eye article gives an example from May, where Trump apparently told Netanyahu directly that an attack would be inappropriate because he felt he was close to getting a deal with Iran. So the huge risk highlighted here, according to the sources, was this fear. If Israel went against Trump and struck Iran anyway, Trump might just leave Israel to face the consequences, the Iranian retaliation, completely alone.
That's a massive gamble.
Absolutely. The sources really talk about the unpredictability this created, Trump's mercurial governing style, as they put it. It apparently made it hard even for U.S. officials who knew about the Israeli war plans to predict how he'd actually react if Israel acted. And the article contrasts this uncertainty with the Biden administration, which it notes directly helped defend Israel during Iranian attacks twice in 2024.
A very different approach.
Very different. The sources point to specific things Trump did that they saw as sidelining Israel's interests, like talking directly with Hamas about captives, agreeing a truce with the Houthis, even while they were attacking Israel, even apparently snubbing Netanyahu on a Gulf trip. These actions, the sources suggest, showed he was willing to go his own way, separate from Israeli priorities. And Christopher McCallion from Defense Priorities is quoted suggesting Trump might break with Israel simply over avoiding U.S. involvement in a war with Iran more generally, not even necessarily tied just to the nuclear deal itself.
That really paints a picture of how central and potentially volatile the U.S. relationship was perceived to be, especially under Trump, according to these sources. What about other players in the region, the Gulf states, for instance?
That's another major constraint. The sources detail the regional dimension. Pincus is quoted again saying Israel's threats are also limited by worries in the Gulf. The article reminds us that back in October 2024, when things got tense, Iran made serious threats, including potentially shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, absolutely vital for oil shipping, and hitting U.S. bases in the region.
Which would directly impact the Gulf states.
Exactly. Pincus spells out the potential fallout. If Israel acts alone, it will be blamed in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi for Iranian retaliation on the Gulf. So unilateral strike could, according to these sources, badly damage Israel's ties with Arab states, potentially making them targets for Iranian revenge.
Okay, so U.S. unpredictability, regional blowback. What else?
Well, finally, the sources keep coming back to just the sheer uncertainty of it all and the massive amount of risk involved. Aaron David Miller, who used to be a U.S. Middle East negotiator, makes a really interesting point. He says even if Iran's economy is weaker, Israel is still described as being unnerved by the unknown. He points out that Iran has significantly increased its uranium enrichment since the U.S. left the nuclear deal in 2018, yet Israel hasn't launched a major strike in that time.
That's true.
Miller argues this tells me a unilateral Israeli strike is risky, and the implications are uncertain. It suggests a level of caution, maybe, despite the capability. And adding to that, Aaron Lerman, who used to be a deputy director at Netanyahu's National Security Council, is quoted saying that Netanyahu, facing such a huge decision, would really prefer to share the political burden, the responsibility for attacking Iran with the U.S.
Right. Not wanting to carry that weight alone. Okay, that's a really comprehensive look at the obstacles. It sounds like the picture from these sources is Israel might have the tools, yes, but the political calculations, the strategic risks, the regional factors, and especially that relationship with the U.S., they all act as powerful brakes. So this leads to the critical question, really, for you listening. What could change that? What specific condition, according to these sources, might actually shift this balance and push Israel towards acting alone? Is there a potential trigger they identify?
It's fascinating, actually. The sources do point towards a specific potential red line, voiced by figures like Aaron Lerman. He explicitly states that Iran enriching uranium on its own soil is that line for Israel.
Ah, so not just enrichment generally, but specifically enrichment happening inside Iran.
That's how Lerman frames it in the sources, yes.
Ah.
And he's even quoted suggesting Israel could be just weeks away from that moment, which implies, from his perspective at least, a potentially closing time window for action.
Weeks away. That sounds quite imminent based on that view.
It does add a sense of urgency from that particular viewpoint in the article. Now, there's also uncertainty discussed around this very point in the context of the Trump administration's negotiations. The sources mention reports from places like Axios and the New York Times suggesting the White House might have been considering allowing Iran a low level of enrichment, maybe temporarily, as part of a deal.
Which would directly conflict with Israel's stated red line.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity. What if the U.S. agreed to something Israel considered unacceptable? However, Aaron David Miller brings in a really important nuance here. He suggests that given Israel's past restraint, even Iran crossing that enrichment threshold might not automatically trigger a unilateral strike.
Oh, so even enrichment might not be enough.
According to Miller's perspective in the sources, possibly not on its own. He thinks a strike would likely require something more. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, and the CIA reaching very different conclusions.
Different conclusions, meaning what exactly?
Meaning a shared, urgent assessment between them about the advanced state of Iran's actual weaponization efforts. Not just enrichment, but solid proof they were close to building the bomb itself. Miller argues you'd need that kind of intelligence agreement to convince Israeli leaders they'd entered a zone of inevitability where Iran getting a bomb was basically certain and imminent.
I see. So a much higher bar confirmed weaponization, not just enrichment capability.
That's Miller's view. And he adds one more crucial qualifier about Netanyahu's decision-making. He states flatly that Netanyahu is not going to preemptively strike Iran without an American green or flashing yellow light.
So it all comes back to the U.S. signal in the end.
It seems that way, according to Miller's analysis in these sources. That perceived approval, or at least non-objection from the U.S., remains critical.
Okay, that really highlights the interconnectedness of it all. Understanding these potential triggers, the specific red line on enrichment in Iran, the idea of a closing window, Miller's point about needing hard intelligence on weaponization, and ultimately that vital American green or flashing yellow light. It's crucial for grasping the real dynamics. And for you, if you're analyzing current affairs, perhaps for UPSC prep, really digging into source material like this Middle East Eye article gives you that detailed, multifaceted view you need. It shows the different perspectives and complexities involved. So let's try and wrap up this deep dive. Based only on the sources we've looked at, the core tension is pretty clear, isn't it? Israel seems to have significant technical ability, detailed plans for a solo strike. But this is held back by really substantial political, strategic, regional, and maybe above all, U.S.-related hurdles and risks.
Yeah.
And this whole complex equation is framed by that potential closing window, that specific red line about enrichment, but with the final decision seemingly hanging on intelligence about weaponization and, critically, those perceived signals from Washington. For you listening, especially if you track global security or need this kind of analysis for exams like the UPSC spending time with detailed sources like the Middle East Eye article we focused on, is how you get beyond the headlines. It's how you build a really solid and nuanced understanding of these critical international issues.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something that comes through quite strongly from these sources. Perhaps the biggest uncertainty here isn't actually about Iran's technical capabilities, how close they are or aren't. Maybe the real wild card is the unpredictable nature of the key people involved, their decisions, their reactions. Especially as we discussed how that American green or flashing yellow light ultimately plays out, or maybe doesn't. It raises a big question, doesn't it? What does that level of human and political uncertainty mean for stability in the region going forward?
That is a powerful question to ponder. And remember, all the detailed analysis, the quotes, the insights we discussed today came directly from the source material provided, including that really insightful Middle East Eye article. If you found this deep dive helpful, if it maybe clarified some of the complexities for you, please do give it a like. Definitely subscribe to the feed so you don't miss our future deep dives into the articles and reports shaping our world. And we genuinely want to hear from you. Please leave a comment below with any further questions or thoughts you have based on the sources we talked about today. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.